Welcome back to another episode of the Boss Economics World, where we dive into the real issues affecting the economy, while exposing the cracks in the government and financial institutions that's left ordinary people like you and me, well, dangling on the precipice of disaster. Today, folks, we're looking at a prime example of the economic recession stamped all over America, a story that makes the Titanic seem like a pleasure cruise in comparison. Imagine your whole life, you've worked hard, you've saved your pennies or, in some cases, your hundreds of thousands of dollars, thinking you're finally safe and sound in your golden years. Then, suddenly, here comes the iceberg, financial mismanagement, bankruptcy, and the crushing clutches of market failures. I'm talking about none other than Bob Curtis, an 87-year-old, and his wife Sandy, who became the unsuspecting casualties of the Harborside, a retirement community on Long Island that turned their golden years into a financial nightmare. But here's the thing, Bob and Sandy aren't alone, nearly 200 others like them are facing the same grim fate, just as baby boomers everywhere are finding themselves pulled into the same vortex of financial collapse. So, what exactly happened here? More significantly, what are the economic forces stirring this stress-inducing cocktail of chaos in the first place? Let's dig a little deeper. Behind this tragic personal account lurks the larger arena of financial infrastructure collapse, labor shortages, diluted fiscal expectations post-COVID, and an intergenerational tug-of-war pulling at the fiscal foundations of baby boomers, and it's rippling through the entire U.S. economy. Particularly, the continuing care retirement communities, CCRC, market is becoming the canary in the coal mine. Let's roll up our sleeves and explore how chronic underfunding, economic mismanagement, and regulatory blindness are setting the stage for a very public meltdown. Now, in theory, retirement communities like the Harborside are supposed to be safe havens where the elderly can settle in for the long haul, assured of lifetime care in exchange for steep entrance fees, the typical chunk being, like Bob and Sandy's case, a cool $840,000 check. The concept on paper is rosy, pay an upfront fee for entrance, and in return, you get independent living, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing, meals, and social activities all bundled together. Your family is then spared the emotional and financial rockslide that comes with caretaking for aging relatives or skyrocketing nursing care costs. But what's really happening behind the scenes? Folks, the structure of these CCRCs paints a grim picture. These facilities have become ticking time bombs of debt dependency and shaky financial acrobatics. The upfront entrance fees aren't placed safely in a vault somewhere for future care expenses. Instead, they go directly into paying off old debts, operating costs, and, believe it or not, service refunds to the previous residents. This Ponzi-esque structure unravels when a cash flow disruption hits, whether it's a drop in new residents due to COVID, rising supply in staffing costs, or an economic downturn that spooks potential buyers. Now, toss in an aging population living longer than ever before, and you've got a delicate house of cards swaying under any negative breeze. In fact, a recent study by CRF International, a nonprofit organization that accredits senior care services, found that 50% of CCRCs like the Harborside ended up operating in the red last year. That's half of these so-called safe havens. 50%. These communities are essentially living week to week, hand to mouth, relying on entrance fees to stay afloat, praying that more residents don't start piling in faster than they can pay for because, surprise. Newcomers' fees are often used to refund the entrance costs of those passing away or moving to long-term care. In other words, unless the conveyor belt of new residents keeps running, they're sunk. It's becoming all the more apparent that CCRCs are rooted in an unsustainable financial model. They focus much of their revenue on day-to-day operational costs and refund obligations rather than creating large reserve funds for the long-term care everyone knows they need. In essence, most CCRCs are over-leveraged and underprepared for anticipated long stays and shifts in the economy, all amid an era of rising wage demands from healthcare workers, increased pandemic-induced costs, and Did I mention labor shortages? Not only are these CCRCs running lean on financial reserves, but the industry is also grappling with a severe shortage of healthcare and assisting staff. And let's not pretend that this is a recent problem. The healthcare sector has been plagued by staffing problems for years, but the pandemic hit the final nail in the coffin. Workers resigned en masse, disillusioned or worn down by the grueling work conditions, and don't even get me started on the pitiful wages. Labor shortages hit 15-year highs in 2023, driving average nursing wages up significantly. That's right, across the American healthcare industry, wages jumped over 8% in 2023, with registered nurses seeing hourly rates soar upwards of $40 to $50 an hour in many markets. Sounds good for the nurses, right? Except, if you're running a senior care facility with already shaky financials, skyrocketing wages for skilled nursing only accelerates your financial nosedive. As the labor market remains tight, these facilities are forced to rely on overpriced agency staff to fill the gaps, which can push wage costs even higher. And oh, we're not done yet. Healthcare providers aren't merely bleeding money via wages, they're also getting squeezed on the supply chain front. Thanks again, pandemic. Medical supplies, maintenance tools, food costs, everything has been caught in the vortex of inflation. Prices for even basic healthcare and cleaning necessities have been marked up by as much as 30%. Add the fact that baby boomers are living longer, and the result is an industry drowning in rising costs but incapable of pulling in new revenue streams fast enough. Previously, baby boomers, a demographic of over 72 million people, used their widespread influence to reshape industries, but as they retire in droves, they're coming face to face with systemic financial black holes like CCRCs, which promise to handle retirement with dignity but now can't even find the funds to keep the lights on. Let's pause for a moment and look at risk, the kind of risk most of these CCRC residents never imagined they were exposing themselves to. When Bob, Sandy, and nearly 200 others moved into the Harborside, they were entering a contract they believed was built on reliability and trust. After all, isn't that what we should expect when dropping nearly $1 million up front? Well, here's the kicker, the system classifies these residents, effectively, as unsecured creditors in cases of bankruptcy, which means that in the case of financial trouble, they're the lowest priority to get any of their money back. Instead, highly secured financial investors and bondholders walk away with their hands relatively clean, while the elderly residents, oh, they're lucky to get 25 cents on the dollar. Do you smell the irony yet? The people who plowed their life savings into these communities, who trusted continuing care with their futures, are now left scraping pennies while corporate bondholders rake in cash from the wreckage. This is systemic. A failure stretches beyond the boardrooms of the Harborside. It resides in the bond market, threading through Wall Street as investors gobbled up high-yield municipal bonds that financed these communities to begin with. Cherry on the cake. Over 5% of the $36 billion in securities used for financing CCRCs are now in default. The typical default rate on your municipal bond is a tiny 0.1%, just a raindrop in the bucket, but CCRCs? Again, 5% default rate, making it 50 times the average default rate for securities issued by cities, counties, or other municipal entities. Even in cases where senior residents manage to squeeze something back from a CC bankruptcy, the outcome is a pittance, often, just cents on the dollar. Just ask the elderly tortoises over at Michigan's Henry Ford Village, where residents got about 25 cents for every dollar owed to them, while bondholders happily walked away fully paid. That's the kind of corporate feasting that America's aged are up against. Let's not rustle off without holding the government accountable, shall we? When CCRCs barreled toward bankruptcy with such frequency, and after 3 bankruptcy filings at the Harborside alone over the last decade, how has New York State been so woefully inconsistent in oversight? Technically, in New York, CCRCs are required to maintain some level of reserve funds, liquid assets equal to at least 35% of their operating costs in a given year. But as those of us who have been paying attention can tell you, this regulatory buffer clearly isn't enough. More importantly, there's simply no sign of federal oversight to ensure stronger safety nets for the aged population thrusted into these murky waters. Regulators allowed the Harborside to struggle for over a decade, culminating in this latest fiasco where an Iowa-based firm, Life Care Companies, LCS, tried to swoop in as a financial lifeline, but were blocked by New York State's Department of Health, DOH. LCS had even sunk $1 million into keeping the Harborside afloat while it worked toward regulatory approval, but DOH rejected the purchase as deficient, leaving residents like Bob and Sandy stuck in limbo. The DOH dragged its feet and ultimately killed what may have been the last lifeline for this floundering institution. It raises one major question: is our regulatory system actively monitoring and safeguarding the elderly, or are they just sleepwalking through catastrophic failures? Even with 41 states regulating CCRCs in some way, the requirements heavily differ. Some states, like New York, technically mandate minimum reserve fund levels, but the lack of comprehensive, standardized oversight means that the financial health of CCRC facilities can vary wildly from state to state, and even within states like New York, multiple bankruptcies don't always trigger substantive action. The loose regulatory framework and inconsistent enforcement show just how vulnerable many of these residents are, both in terms of their life savings and their long-term care options. Let's also note that CCRCs are allowed to carry a significant amount of debt, often financed through muni bonds that are aggressively pitched to bondholders on Wall Street. High-yield bonds tied to CCRCs present an alluring opportunity to investors looking for returns, but the risk is disproportionately borne by the residents, not the investors. This is precisely why bondholders typically walk away with full or near full payment in bankruptcy cases, while families face the horrifying possibility of losing their homes and savings. It's a tale of two systems, one that protects those with the capital to buy risky municipal bonds, and another that leaves middle-class retirees at the mercy of broken promises. Folks, this isn't just about Bob and Sandy and the Harborside. It's a glaring reflection of systemic risks that have been bubbling under the surface of the healthcare and senior care industries for years. The sheer scale of baby boomers moving into retirement, approximately 10,000 boomers turn 65 each day in the US, means more and more elderly Americans are depending on CCRC facilities and related long-term care options. Meanwhile, the market for age-related services is undergoing unprecedented stress due to labor shortages, soaring costs, and financial mismanagement. For every Bob and Sandy you read about, there are millions more nearing their post-retirement years who will also have to trust institutions that are no longer on stable financial footing. But here's the kicker: while millions of Americans are moving toward needing long-term care solutions, government policy and private sector practices have not strategically planned for this demographic shift, leaving a growing chasm between the needs of retirees and the services available. If the Harborside's mishaps, and other CCRC bankruptcies, are indicative of broader market patterns, then we are heading for an even bigger crisis in senior care. The increase in CCRC bankruptcies since 2020, at least 16 CCRCs filed for bankruptcy during the pandemic, is only the tip of the iceberg. The COVID-19 pandemic acted as a grim accelerant in this downward spiral. Lockdown measures disrupted these facilities' ability to bring in new residents, which in turn stunted cash flow. With no new revenue, costs kept piling up. The ripple effects, shortages of already scarce healthcare workers, rising operating costs due to inflation, and problems in attracting new buyers, have pushed many CCRCs, especially those operating on a single-site basis, like the Harborside, to the brink. And with 50% of the CCRCs operating on a single site reporting financial losses in 2023, the chances of future bankruptcies fueled by these structural issues look more and more likely. Let's zoom out even further, because folks, this isn't just a problem for retired seniors and baby boomers. This is about how risk is increasingly being shoveled onto ordinary citizens, while large institutions remain insulated from the fallout. For example, the municipal bond markets, which play a central role in financing CCRCs, are designed to be low risk, high reward for investors. The irony here is as thick as it is bitter. Municipal bonds have long been considered one of the safest asset classes, with default rates historically below 0.1%. But municipalities financing these snake oil retirement promises are packing more risk than your average city-issued bond. A shocking 5% default rate on municipal bonds tied to CCRCs, compared to the 0.1% average default rate, exposes the fundamental volatility in this marketplace. Yet, as high-yield municipal bonds climb in default rates due to failing CCRCs, it's the residents who suffer first. Bondholders are secured against potential failures, which means that when a CCRC enters bankruptcy, bondholders are generally first in line to collect. Seniors with unsecured claims on their residences or refund promises are left scrambling for pennies on the dollar. This creates a perverse incentive structure, where the financial world can safely gamble on CCRCs because they're insulated by their secured status and the cushion offered by high-yield market returns. Meanwhile, elderly residents like Bob Curtis find themselves holding the short end of the stick, essentially trapped as unsecured creditors in their own homes. It's financial cannibalism dressed up in slick promises about lifetime care. This brings us to an increasingly urgent question: what happens when an entire generation of Americans, who've been raised on the promise of affordable retirement care, find that stash of promises dwindling as facilities fall deeper into financial trouble? Our analysis paints an unsettling picture: a system where CCRCs and related industries stand precariously on the brink, and by extension, where the retirement prospects for millions of baby boomers are under threat. The baby boomer demographic bulge, while once seen as a domineering force in reshaping industries and driving consumption, now represents an overwhelming challenge for senior care and healthcare industries struggling to meet their massive, evolving needs. So what's next? Will the CCRCs that should offer a comfortable last home for millions of retirees become ghost towns of aged debtors as more and more facilities crumble under financial strain? Or can we collectively find ways to address these issues before they work their way up to a full-blown economic crisis? Bob Curtis and his neighbors at the Harborside are direct victims of a much larger failing, a systematic policy vacuum intended to protect aging populations. The U.S., unlike many other advanced economies, has not built a comprehensive, federal-level plan to accommodate the shifting demographics moving into retirement care and senior housing. It's a sorry testament to the country's prioritization of short-term economic gains over long-term, sustainable care solutions. The policy shortcomings are glaring, and here's where they stand out most. 1. Inconsistent state regulations. While 41 states have some form of regulation for CCRCs, they vary wildly. There is no unified federal approach that ensures continued care for residents or creates standardized safeguards against financial failures. States like New York wield some regulatory power by requiring reserve funds, but even these measures are weak, inconsistent, and poorly enforced. Meanwhile, multi-state operators can leverage state bureaucratic loopholes to put communities like the Harborside through repeated bankruptcies. 2. Insufficient federal oversight. Why in the world do we not have federal standards for these CCRCs, given how widespread the issue is? There's simply no justifiable reason why discrepancies in care, financial stability, and regulatory protection should persist based solely on geography. 3. Too much dependence on muni bonds. The cracks in the municipal bond market, particularly in regards to CCRCs, demonstrate just how exposed investors and residents alike are to economic downturns. The continued issuance of high-risk bonds to finance aging facilities already struggling shows that gambling is still happening within the bond industry, and you better believe the residents aren't aware that this risk is hanging over their heads like the sword of Damocles. Where do we go from here? The problem is not just limited to correcting past wrongs, we need forward-looking reform to tackle the incoming tsunami set to devastate America's elderly. Without a comprehensive, determined approach to addressing the future of senior housing and long-term care, we are facing a meltdown of epic proportions that could destabilize large swathes of the economy, victimizing millions of retirees along the way. A set of key reforms could make the world of difference in staving off a full-fledged crisis. 1. Federal regulation for CCRCs. It's time for the U.S. government to create uniform federal regulations to maintain stricter financial buffers for CCRCs and eliminate state-by-state discrepancies. A nationwide policy requiring stronger reserves, improved transparency in financial dealings, and enhanced consumer protection from bankruptcies must be implemented. 2. Debt and investor prudence. Bond agencies and municipal issuers should be forced to adopt stricter criteria before they can fund these retirement communities. Increased oversight of the municipal bond markets would reduce the moral hazard currently skewing the risk toward elderly residents. 3. Increased reserve requirements. The 35% annual reserve required in New York is far too little. Raising these requirements to cover at least 50–75% of operating costs would provide a more concrete financial foundation, preventing CCRCs from being dependent on a constant influx of new residents. 4. Expanded public funding for long-term care. Relying solely on private sector solutions has clearly failed. To protect seniors from the instability of the private sector, expanded public funding for long-term care options is essential. This could take the form of increased Medicaid support for long-term care, the establishment of new public-private partnerships that ensure senior care facilities have stable funding, or the development of a nationalized senior care insurance program that offers government-backed guarantees against the types of financial collapses we've seen. Without a more robust safety net, seniors will remain vulnerable to the whims of the market, and that's simply unacceptable in one of the richest countries in the world. 5. Stronger consumer protections in contracts. The case of Bob and Sandy Curtis highlights a major flaw in the contracts many seniors sign with these CCRCs. Too often, residents are classified as unsecured creditors in the event of a bankruptcy. Could we imagine this in any other real estate market? If someone bought a house for $840,000 and the developer went bankrupt, how would we react if they were told they'd only get 25 cents on the dollar? That's why strong contractual protections must be embedded in CCRC agreements. Residents' fees should be escrowed or locked into insured protections, ensuring that they are prioritized if a company's financial outlook goes sour. 6. Exit solutions for seniors. When a facility like the Harborside heads for bankruptcy, residents often face the grim reality of being unable to afford the next phase of care or relocation without massive cuts to their savings. Policymakers should devise emergency exit strategies, offering government-subsidized options for seniors who suddenly find themselves homeless due to mismanaged CCRCs. This could be tied to Medicare or Medicaid programs, which could offer temporary housing or care stipends for displaced individuals. 7. Updated labor policies to improve healthcare staffing. As we discussed earlier, the labor shortage in healthcare is a massive problem compounded by the aging of the baby boomer population. A serious investment in training, recruiting, and retaining healthcare workers is urgently needed. Policymakers must consider targeted wage increases, tuition forgiveness for healthcare degrees, and improved working conditions for healthcare staff. Public incentives and training programs aimed at building a stable healthcare workforce, especially those skilled in geriatric care, would mitigate the severity of staffing shortfalls in retirement communities. 8. A national senior care strategy. Finally, it's high time the U.S. develops a national senior care strategy. Much like how other nations assess their aging populations with future forecasts for housing, healthcare, and social services, the U.S. needs a coordinated, forward-looking plan. This should happen at the federal level, bringing together experts in economics, healthcare, urban planning, and social policy to chart a sustainable path forward. Without this, we're essentially tossing our elderly onto a financial minefield and hoping enough of them will make it through unscathed. Folks, it's easy to think of this as an isolated problem, $130 million owed to retirees here, 200 residents displaced there. Yet, what we're really seeing at the Harborside, and other similar facilities, is a canary in the coal mine for broader American economic problems. The fallout from the retirement home crisis speaks to themes we're seeing in other parts of the economy: overleveraging, financialization of essential services, regulatory failure, and risk mismanagement shifted onto everyday citizens. Does this sound familiar? It should. Think back to the 2008 financial crisis, where predatory financing and weak regulatory oversight in housing markets triggered a global economic collapse. While the stakes here may seem smaller on the surface, the risks are biting at the heels of America's rapidly aging population, one that is millions strong and economically significant. Consider the broad ripple effects that these CCRC bankruptcies could have. 1. Declining consumer confidence. Older generations are one of the largest consumer bases in developed economies, particularly in sectors like healthcare, real estate, and insurance. A crisis in retirement security could spook that demographic into retreating from spending, preferring to hoard resources and live conservatively, further hurting demand in the already brittle post-pandemic economy. 2. Municipal bond turbulence. Municipal bonds are a cornerstone of institutional investment portfolios. Cities and local governments use them to raise capital for public projects like roads, schools, and, yes, healthcare institutions like CCRCs. A continuing stream of defaults in these sectors could spill over and create broader uncertainty within the municipal bond market, pushing national and state treasury departments into murkier waters. This would lead to higher borrowing costs for communities across America and could stunt local economic growth. 3. The erosion of trust in financial markets. If elderly Americans, particularly those in wealthier cohorts, begin losing substantial portions of their savings to failed retirement plans, there could be national repercussions in terms of wealth concentration. The erosion of middle-class savings would lead to even more economic polarization. The wealthy can afford to withstand these collapses, but the brunt of the pain will fall on middle-class retirees, exacerbating wealth inequality and triggering a distrust in the very institutions meant to guard people's savings. 4. Health and social anxiety. As CCRCs falter, there's also the grim reality that public health infrastructure could be overwhelmed. If hundreds of these communities go under within a short period, there won't be enough Medicaid beds to cover the influx of elderly patients. This in turn puts pressure on general hospitals, where care for elderly patients requiring assisted living or memory care may be inadequate. The broader humanitarian crisis could then morph into a fully fledged public health crisis. We began by discussing Bob Curtis and his wife Sandy, two elderly Americans who, after saving and planning for their twilight years, now face the terrifying prospect of losing everything they thought was secured. Their story is far from unique in today's America. The retirement community collapse at the Harborside is one incident in a much larger, festering wound within the American economic system. What's truly scary about this situation isn't just the collapse of one CCRC, it's that millions of Americans are unwittingly queued up to face the same dangers. The baby boomer retirement crisis and the corresponding collapse of CCRCs are illustrative of broader economic, regulatory, and social failures that we've neglected for too long. This isn't just about one or two individuals, it's about the systemic failures that continually put ordinary citizens at risk while the wealthy and well-connected walk away unscathed. It might be too late to save every retiree currently living in precarious conditions across America's CCRCs, but it's not too late to rebuild the system. What's required here is a combination of bold economic regulation, moral political leadership, consumer protection, financial prudence, and long-term strategic planning. Unfortunately, if policymakers don't take swift action, if they leave the private sector to bumble and scheme their way through senior care, we're not looking at a potential future crisis, but a present one unfolding right before our eyes. This is about one thing, the dignity of aging in America. And right now, we're failing, spectacularly. That's all for today's deep dive, folks. As always, stay informed, stay safe, and keep asking the hard questions about how our economy is really managed, because it's your future on the line.